So since this is an invitation to listen, that's how we're going to begin. Some of you like to close your eyes. You can listen better that way. It's up to you, whatever makes you feel comfortable.
This is WNYC 93.9 FM, AM 820, and online at WNYC.org. It's 8:51. Good morning. I'm Mark Hyland. As we told you just moments ago, there has been some sort of an incident at the World Trade Center, an apparent accident involving an airplane of some type. We have an eyewitness to the explosion at the World Trade Center this morning in the Northern Tower. Charlie Hines works for WNYC. Charlie, tell us what you saw as an eyewitness.
Mark, unbelievable. A airplane flying apparently out of control. It appeared to be an American Airlines plane. And I thought flying toward Newark, but good gosh, that's so low.
Thinking of what people will say, we're doing it just for the money. But it's not that. We were hurt as kids. They hurt us, and it can never be fixed.
Listening is transporting. It connects to our emotional centers. It connects to parts of our brain. It stirs and triggers pictures in our imagination. And there's a reason for that. Evolutionary psychologists and biologists believe that our species succeeded partially because we listened to each other. We listened to each other's stories. That gave us references and senses of tribal laws and dangers and a sense of cohesion. This is something that I have worked a long time at, this kind of idea of listening and connecting with each other. It triggers pleasure centers in the brain, and all of our survival instincts, all of our senses have done that for us through the ages. And I'm not arguing that listening is the most important, but only that, especially now, at a time when sound is coming all around us, when you're pumping gas, when you're at the convenience store, with the 20 million channels that are all around us, at the same time as the incidence of individual conversations are shrinking, that we text instead of call, we post to Facebook instead of meeting with each other. We go to the internet and sit by ourselves and look at things that interest us rather than seeking out other people and discussing it. And I'm not arguing that those are bad things. I mean, I think some of those environments are intensely social in their own way. But just to think about what place listening has as we go forward in this kind of an environment. And again, you know, I want you to have the most pleasure in your brain possible. And listening does trigger pleasure centers. And I've spent my entire career in broadcasting, so I want you to like it. You'll probably get a, tote bag or a mug if you do like it, of course. So my work has been very much about this concept of broadcasting, and broadcasting is originally an agrarian term. It means to throw out seeds, to cast out seeds in the field, not knowing whether they will land, where they will land, or whether they will actually produce fruit. And we don't know what will happen. There are cultural historians who propose that in the 20th century, and especially in the building up 40s, 50s, and 60s, when black music and soul music in particular were available in clear channels all around the country, that helped actually stir the foundations of the civil rights movement. The idea was that if Otis Redding singing could puncture you, could be speaking and articulating something that was so meaningful to you, maybe these Negroes weren't who we thought they were or who we were told they were. This is something that I've kept alive, I hope, in my work in broadcasting, which has been primarily making radio, but I've also made some sound installations and done a lot of work in developing nations and setting up radio stations and also radio station networks, creating sustainable stations, especially in places where there had been no tradition of non-state communication. So in places like Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal, Mali, South Africa. And some of the things that I saw were immediate in those places. For example, there was a radio station called Radio Pinchme, and that was a Wolof word for the gathering tree where people would come together in the village and talk. So they set up this radio station with that same name, a kind of virtual gathering tree. And in the first season that it was on the air, there were 40% fewer cases of malaria in that precinct. And consistently in the stations that I worked with in West Africa, they were the highest voter turnout precincts. So people, when given access to good information, will make good decisions about their lives. That was one of the things that I came away with. I also worked in a number of post-conflict zones, including in Sierra Leone. And I'll just give you a shamefully capsule picture and unnuanced review of what happened in Sierra Leone. There was a brutal, completely savage civil war from 1991 to 2002. And to give you a little sense of what it was about, neighboring Charles Taylor in Liberia needed to fund his own fight against rebellion in his country. So his strategy was to consolidate power around the diamond mines in Sierra Leone. And it was easy to foment revolution in that place because, for years the government had been corrupt. People were far, far away from the center where decisions were made in Freetown. And they had no sense of the government actually being on their side. So he helped foment this revolution, and their tool was basically terrorizing local populations so they could own the diamond wealth. Their tool, unfortunately, was amputation. They had crude machetes, amputating arms, legs, noses, ears, lips. This was part of the way that they sowed fear in the local population and cut a broad swath through the country. At the end, 50,000 people were dead. About 2/3 of the population had been displaced. A quarter of those fighting, and there were several different factions, about 4 factions majorly, were under the age of 18. So what happened after the war, they made a peace agreement, a tentative peace agreement, and had to put 72,000 soldiers back into the population. It made for a lot of tension, obviously. And where radio comes in is there was a Search for Common Ground. They're an international NGO who's done a lot of work in conflict resolution and media as a tool for conflict resolution. They created Talking Drum Studio. And the Talking Drum Studio was making a program. They have since made several, but at the time making this program called Atunda Ayenda, which means lost and found. And it was a way that they could characterize what civil society looked like. They had several different cast members from several different interest groups, a soldier, an RUF fighter, a person who'd been an amputee. And they were living together, having conversations, and in some way modeling what dissent sounded like. You could have dissent in a way that worked. So I'll just play a little bit of Atunda Ayenda. This is in Pidgin English, so you might recognize some of the words, but it was about paying taxes and the necessity of that.
Yes, I don't really know what to do now for solving this tax problem. I don't know.
But the civil society, the only thing for solving the tax wahala. I'm not worried about that.
I don't fed up with one old tax problem. I don't fed up.
Now, no, it's in the go on. Let's make another talk.
We not go know, but we get plenty confidence for it.
That very civil society they're not serious at all.
So this was an enormously successful program. And they have since, as I said, created several others. And they're modeling in some ways, creating a precedent for talking about problems that had not been there before. This was not how conflict had been resolved. So in the meantime, I'm going back and forth from Africa. I'm living in New York City at the time, working in new media. We're talking about changing the media paradigm. And especially when I started, this was in the late 1990s. And I remember coming back and the whole Monica Lewinsky Bill Clinton thing had blown up, right? And I couldn't even talk to members of my family about what was going on. You know, so here I was working in sort of conflict resolution and inspiring civil dialogue and realizing that I was resistant to hearing what other people had to say. We were in the first stages of what people called the divided society, which has since gotten woefully, woefully worse. So one of the things that was part of a motivation for me to apply for a fellowship, and I did get it, and in September of 2001, I started my fellowship. So at a time when there was a lot to talk about in the United States, obviously. So I worked with several different groups, but one of them was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was where the fellowship was, the Riverside community. This was a neighborhood, a very diverse, traditional neighborhood that had been there for a long time, and they felt like Harvard University was encroaching upon their neighborhood, right? They had a lot of resources and power in the community, and they had been fighting with each other for decades. And their meetings were characterized by, you know, the people in Riverside pulling the arrows out of their quiver and saying, you did this, and Harvard parrying. And it had been really bitter and sometimes a really chaotic conversation. So I worked with them on setting up some meetings with Harvard. And what we did is created very sort of focused stories, like 2 minutes, keeping a tight limit around it, where they could go and talk about their experience of living in a community, what it meant to them. So instead of fighting, coming from a position of, this is what my life is like here. And it didn't fix things, certainly, but it did lead to a number of really interesting conversations. That's the thing. We never know what will come out of these conversations. Little did I know at the same time that this was happening, the Public Conversations Project was stirring in up the street in Watertown, Massachusetts, which we all have heard a lot about. This was started in 1994 by 6 women. This was after 3 people had been killed by a gunman in Planned Parenthood clinics, both in Brookline, Massachusetts, and Norfolk, Virginia. So these 3 vehemently anti-choice women and 3 actively pro-choice women, these are all in the sort of leadership rung of their own respective organizations, got together and secretly started talking with each other. And they did this for 6 years. They decided to come out in 2001 in a Boston Globe op-ed. And in 2003, NPR's Margot Adler spoke to them. This is just a little clip from a couple of them.
There were many different levels. One of the most serious to me was the fact that if people within the pro-life community knew that I was doing this, they might think that I was somehow or other sort of sitting with the enemy, so to speak, and that I was sort of a traitor to the pro-life movement. So that was a concern at a very deep level for me. That's not what I was doing, but you know, perception is very important, really, in public policy type issues.
First of all, we came to develop a real affection for each other. Also because it was very intellectually stimulating. You were forced to really dig down very deep to say why you believed what you believed.
The interesting thing about this group is that nobody changed their minds. In fact, they became, in some ways, more sort of aligned with their own positions. But they became friends. They ate together. Their families started to know each other. They became people who were connected over something more than just their conflict. So this is something that I've been thinking a lot about as somebody who works in the media, works in the area of you know, presenting to other people what conflict looks like. This, of course, is the pretty much standard American concept of listening. The opposite of talking isn't listening. The opposite of talking is waiting. It's Fran Lebowitz. You know, you're sort of just like, when's my turn going to come? I'll just sort of wait and blank out when this person is speaking and wait till it's my turn. So for me, it's been important to cultivate an ability to listen, which I think for me is also an ability to be silent. This is, I think, a special challenge, and it's also, you know, kind of funny coming from me. I'm a broadcaster, right? But I really feel like I'm doing my job best when I'm listening. There is a lot of pressure. I don't do this perfectly by any means. In fact, there's a lot of thinking in my part of like, well, I'm talking to this person, but I've got to connect it to a narrative arc, and I've got 3.5 minutes left, and kind of like right now, I don't think I'm at a resolution. So I've got to race the clock against that. But that's the temptation. It's important to pull back and just be silent and listen And I think this is especially true right now because all of us are, we live in this space where there are a zillion different opportunities for us to put ourselves out there, right? YouTube, broadcast yourself. And those stories, a lot of those stories are absolutely worth listening to. But what I'm asking you to think about is getting away from that idea that we have to be first, that we have to put out the most profound tweet, that we have to have access to information and we have to tell our story before anyone else can tell it, because that is what gives us value. I actually think that there's a lot of value from myself in the idea of giving up that idea of the curated self, the one that says clever things, and listen to other people. It means, in many ways, giving up the illusion of being in control. We have all of these devices. I had a great conversation with Sherry Turkle after her book Alone Together came out, and she was talking about how we turn to technology more and more to fill up the spaces where we are vulnerable. And we are vulnerable. We are alone. So what do? We create technologies that, as she said so beautifully, give us the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship, right? We don't really listen to a conversation that's going on in front of us, but we only choose the ones that we want to listen to here. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm going to be going around spying on you today and seeing if you're actually looking at your devices. It's not that at all. Because I think those devices are very worthwhile. But just to think about the uncurated world, the world that you are generous enough just to lend your listening ear to. I think that there's a lot of us who want to stand in that safe place and cast out our ideas. So what would it mean to sort of be on the other end of that, to grab that lifeline and listen to somebody else's idea? It's just a thought. It's not a sort of profound takeaway, I don't think, but just something that I'm allowing to live inside of me, inside of my life, and seeing what that means. And like the history of broadcast, you never know what it's going to seed, what kind of movement it might create, or what kind of connection it might give you to somebody else. Thank you.